Hello YouTube, my name is Daniel, and welcome to another edition of Education 180. You may be wondering why I'm sitting here making this YouTube video for you. Well, here's the deal. Today I will be talking about the 5th section of the Logical Reasoning module on determining flawed reasoning. You may be wondering what flawed reasoning is. Well, here's a brief definition. Flawed reasoning, also known as a fallacy, is an error in reasoning that renders an argument logically invalid. And here's a brief example. So the ghost says to the tooth, "So good things happened, therefore there's a God." And the tooth gets angry and says, "Well, I can't argue with that because it's not an argument." So in this case, the ghost says, "So good things happen," which is a premise, but it does not guarantee that there is a God, which will foreshadow what we'll be looking at in the coming examples of flawed reasoning. Please take a moment to read through the following common question stems you will encounter when answering flawed reasoning question types. Press pause, and when you're ready to continue, press play. We will continue. So there are two types of flawed reasoning questions. The first is a general type, in which the correct answer choice will critique the reasoning by pointing out that it contains a classic fallacy. What is a fallacy? A fallacy is a premises and conclusion may all be true, but its premises do not assure that the conclusion must be true. And here's a brief example of a common type of fallacy, and afterwards I'll show you a counterexample. So the first two lines are the premises. All mammals are mortal. All cats are mortal. And the conclusion is the last line. Therefore, all cats are mammals. Now in this case, it appears fairly straightforward that the conclusion is true, but the problem with this line of reasoning is that the premises right here do not guarantee that the conclusion will be true. And how do we know this? Well, we come up with a counterexample. Here is a counterexample. All mammals are mortal. All amphibians are mortal. Therefore, all amphibians are mammals. So this is a counterexample to our first line of argument. We can use our general prior knowledge to determine that amphibians are not mammals, and I put the no milk because one of the characteristics of amphibians is that they don't feed their youth milk, which is a trait that mammals do. So this conclusion would be false, and this is an example of a classic fallacy. The second type is a specific type of flaw, where the correct answer choice will attack a specific piece of the argument's reasoning, and this will foreshadow our second sample question stem that we'll look at in the coming slides. When answering questions, remember to eliminate incorrect answers and identify the correct answer. Eliminate answer choices that contain extraneous information. The correct answer choice will describe the particular flaw in the author's reasoning. Please take a moment to read through the following sample of flawed reasoning question 1. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. We will continue. So the archaeologist says the following. If I don't get more private funding soon, I will never be able to find the missing link. So this is an archaeologist. And he says if he gets no funding, or if he doesn't get private funding, he will not be able to find the missing link. Which basically means he won't be able to continue his study if he runs out of funding. And the field student, which is down here, we'll identify him, says, but that's great. If your private funding does come through, the mystery of the missing link will finally be resolved. So the field student says if they do get funding, then they'll find the missing link. The problem with this is that there are no guarantees necessarily that if the archaeologist gets funding that he will necessarily find the missing link. It is necessary for the archaeologist to get funding in order to continue his studies, but he can get $1 million to continue his studies and maybe he'll never be able to find the missing link. So this is an example of necessary versus sufficient. It is necessary to get the money to continue his studies, but it is not sufficient to get the money to find the missing link necessarily. So the field student makes the false claim that, or the false conclusion that if the archaeologist gets money, he will solve the mystery. And we can use that as a preemptive strike in determining the answer for this question. So let's take a look at the following question answers together. So the bottoms of the question right here says, which one of the following statements best describes the flaw in the field student's reasoning? So let's take a look at A together. A says the field student believes the archaeologist will be unable to discover the missing link unless the private funding comes through. If you go back to the argument, this is actually what the archaeologist believes, not the field student. The archaeologist, going back to the argument, says if I don't get more funding, then I won't be able to find the missing link. So we can get rid of A, because the field student did not believe that. It was the archaeologist. Okay, let's take a look at B. The field student thinks that the archaeologist will use the private funding to discover the missing link, rather than for some other purpose. It wasn't expressed in the passage up here that the field student believed that the archaeologist would use the funding for something else. So we can also eliminate this in the passage. Let's take a look at C. The field student believes it is more important to discover the missing link than to make other more significant discoveries. So again, it doesn't say anywhere that this field student believes this. He just believes that if the archaeologist gets money, he'll be able to solve the missing link. So this is again an extraneous answer. It is important when answering these types of questions to stick with what's written in the passage. Let's take a look at D. The field student believes that all the archaeologist needs in order to discover the missing link is more private funding. Bingo. This is what we preempted when we were looking at the line of reasoning in the argument. The field student says if private funding comes through, the problem will be resolved. The funding is necessary but not sufficient to find the missing link. The archaeologist just says he'll never find it without funding, so D is our correct answer. But just for argument's sake, let's take a look at E together. E says the field student thinks that the archaeologist will discover the missing link even if the private funding does not come through. Well, A Well, first off, the field student did not express this in the passage, and B, we know this is false because if the archaeologist does not get more private funding, he won't be able to continue his study, and therefore he won't have a chance in solving the missing link. So E is incorrect. So just to summarize, D was our correct answer. Let's take a look at one more, shall we? Please take a moment to read through Flawed Reasoning question sample type 2. Press pause, and when you are ready to continue, press play. And we will continue. So let's take a look at the line of reasoning together. A politician says, our party has a responsibility to serve the public interest. So here's our politician. I chose the picture of Ronald Reagan. And he says he has a responsibility to serve the public interest. So that's the first sentence. Second line. Thus, when the opposing party contends that our recent cuts to social assistance were excessive, this is the opposing party right here. Who says that the cuts were excessive. Stop the cuts. We can only reply that the overwhelming public interest in these matters makes it our responsibility to make these cuts. So as I'm reading through the argument, one thing that I notice is that there's an ambiguity in the meaning of public interest. So let's take a look at where public interest is in the passage. We got public interest here and public interest here. In the first answer, our party has a responsibility to serve the public interest. In my mind, serving the public interest means that you put forth policies that are going to benefit the community around you. So it's more based on politics and policy. So this is number one. In the second one, we can only reply that the overwhelming public interest in these matters makes it our responsibility to make these cuts. In other words, they're saying that lots of people are interested in this matter, so therefore it must be important. So in other words, there was a slight change, there's a slight nuance change in the meaning of public interest as we progress through the passage. Kind of like this picture. Is it two faces or is it a vase? It has a double meaning. So we can use that to preempt an answer as we read through the possible answer sample types in the question. So the last part of the question says, which one of the following is a flaw in the politician's defense of her party's practice? A says, assuming without argument that there's a right to social assistance. I would say that, if anything, it was the opposing party who assumed there's a right to social assistance. It was a politician who was defending the cuts to social assistance. So if anything, they were against social assistance. So A is incorrect. So let's get rid of that guy. B says, ignoring grounds for criticism of the cuts aside from the fact that they were excessive. I would eliminate B because they weren't ignoring the grounds for criticism. If anything, they were making an effort to reply to the criticisms. So B would also be incorrect. C, intentionally failing to specify what is meant by the word excessive. Well, excessive is right here, and it's written right here. I think that it's fairly clear what is meant by excessive. Basically, it means that there's too much cuts. Therefore, the cuts to social assistance were excessive. So there's no failing in specificity. That's a big word. There's no ambiguity to the word excessive. So let's get rid of that guy. D, confusing political accountability with moral obligation. I would say that the party was being accountable for their actions and that they made an effort to reply to the overwhelming public interest in taking responsibility to make these cuts. And there's no confusion with moral obligation. Moral obligation wasn't even mentioned in this passage. So let's get rid of D. And the final one says, E, improperly exploiting an ambiguity in the phrase public interest. So as we preempted before, there was a change in the meaning of public interest, which the politician took for granted and made it ambiguous. So we said there's an ambiguity in public interest as we don't actually know what it is. And is it even in the public interest to make cuts to social assistance? Maybe for the rich it is because they'll have lower taxes, but for the poor it wouldn't be because they would lose the essential services that they desperately need and can't afford without tax funding. So E is a correct response. And we're going to circle that in green with the check mark. So to summarize, E was a correct response for Flawed Reasoning question 2. Once again, thank you for watching another edition of Education 180 on Flawed Reasoning question types in the Logical Reasoning module. Don't forget to like us on YouTube. And on behalf of Education 180, happy LSAT writing.